Hi everybody, Stu Clark here. Today we're going to be taking a look at the shooting banks and the custom settings menu in the Nikon Z8. These settings are really important for me as I'm a professional wildlife photographer, but I also shoot real estate, landscape, and then in studio here. So it's really important that I utilize these banks effectively so I can get the most out of the camera, and when I'm out in the field, the camera performs as I need it to. Anyone that's moved from a mid-tier Nikon camera, you know, the D70 500, I believe the Z6 in that category, where the cameras utilize the user 1 and user 2 settings, will really wonder why Nikon's made the choice they have going to the custom shooting banks for the high upper tier cameras. So with the U1, U2 settings, when you're out for the day, you can change your aperture, your shutter speed, whatever you need to change in camera for the shoot. Turn the camera on and off, you change it to aperture priority, you switch it back to U1. It's exactly the same settings that when you first set it up. Shooting banks are very different than that, and so because of it, you really got to get head wrapped around how they work, and then you really have to utilize them correctly when you're out in the field, so that you're not completely lost. And it's something that you really have to kind of get set in your ways about using them in order to use them effectively. So the issue with the shooting banks is when you're out in the field, you know, you've got them all set up, you've spent a week, or almost a month for me, going through and tweaking and changing and making all the settings you need, and you think you've got it fully dialed in. You get out, you make some changes, change a few things here and there. Those changes overwrite your saved settings. So basically every change you make then becomes that shooting bank. There's no save setting on the shooting banks. It's basically whatever the settings are, that when you turn the camera off, that's the settings that are now applied there. You can save them to an SD card, which is great, and I highly recommend doing that, especially once you've spent some time and you think you've got it really dialed in. I highly encourage that you do save them to the SD card. That way, before you're going on a trip or something like that, you reset them back to where you want them to be at your saved settings. Okay, so just to be clear, what we're talking about here are the photo shooting menu. So we're looking at the photo shooting menu and shooting bank A, B, C, and D. We're looking at the video recording menu, shooting menu bank A, B, C, and D. Then we're also looking at the custom settings menu, A, B, C, and D. And then in each of those banks, you will have the custom controls that you can customize to benefit each bank. So you get the idea. Nice and simple. This is really clear, easy to do. So yeah, if you get where I'm coming from here. Hopefully by the time we get through this, you'll have a much clearer idea of how these work, and then also how you can start to implement them to work for you. So when you're setting up these shooting banks, the hardest thing to understand, but also the main purpose behind setting them up properly, is shooting bank A applies to both photo and video. As much as you have a photo shooting bank and a video shooting bank, so you're setting up two different menus for photo and video, they both fall under the shooting bank A category. So this is where it's really, really important that the photo and the video make sense, that they're dialed in for the same subject matter or the same setting. If you're just a photographer, you're definitely going to have different setups where my two long lens, shooting bank A and shooting bank B, for the photography side of it are actually quite similar. It's the video side of it that kind of drives the decision-making process at that point. If you're just a photographer, definitely you're probably gonna have quite a bit more variation in your shooting banks. You know, landscape, nature, wildlife, architecture, studio, and you're gonna have, it'll be definitely you'll take advantage of all four banks quite differently. But because it's for me, I'm trying to make it so that the video and the photography side of it makes sense for each bank. There's quite a bit of similarity between the shooting banks, especially. The video side of it is really the driving force here, like I said. Okay, so let's have a look at my shooting banks and the main custom settings that accompanies each bank. Shooting bank A for me is my going out the door wildlife photography run and gun, as we'll call it, for both photo and video. So this is going to be the high efficiency star raw capture. This setting is, it's a slightly smaller file size. I've run into far less buffer issues. And to give you an example, with the card I'm using, it's a Gen 4 Pro Grade Gold card. It's a fast card. I believe it's a 3200 write speed. They say on it, it's actually about 800 megabytes write speed. If you're looking at cards, that's a whole other video and we'll get into that. But anyway, cards are a pain to try and figure out. But anyway, if I shoot in lossless compressed RAW, I definitely run into buffer issues quite quickly. And you notice it I go out to one of the local estuaries or lagoon down here. There's ducks and herons and eagles coming in, all sorts of craziness, where you might have an eagle fly in and it starts chasing a duck back and forth. You will definitely run into buffer issues as you're shooting that whole sequence. This is the high efficiency star. You'll lose a tiny bit of editing ability in the highlights, maybe in the shadows. It's so minute though that for wildlife, I'd way rather get the shot and not run into the buffer. So how I did it was hold the trigger down for 20 seconds and record how many shots you take, and switch cards, switch settings. And with lossless compressed, I'm about roughly 260 shots for 20 seconds. With the high efficiency star, I'm about 80 shots more for that same 20 seconds. So there's going to be a frame in there that might be the shot, and the loss of image quality with high efficiency star is so minimal. That's why I picked this as my running gun. Like I say, this is all about speed and getting the shot. Same thing, I also picked 120 frames per second for the video. And the shooting bank will also be applied for without a tripod. A lot of this will be walking around handheld photography and videography. So with 120 frames per second, that flyover, that 3-second flyover, can be about 12-second long a video when it's slowed down to 30 frames per second. The other benefit of it though, not just getting an extended frame or usable footage, is that you also get far less shake. Once you slow it down, if you're holding at 30 frames per second hand holding, phenomenal IBIS, the VR combination of the lens, this camera is on another level, but you will still get quite a bit of shake. You'll still get movement and shakiness in the footage. When you drop the 120 frames per second down to a 30 frame per second timeline, it really smooths that out. Everything becomes more usable. So that's why another big reason to pick this as my running gun. My shooting bank B is what I call my portrait mode. And so portrait mode, it's not people, it's animal portrait. So this would be where I want optimal quality. So this is going to be 20 frames per second lossless and also 30 frames per second video. And the reason I've chosen 30 frames per second video here is that I want real-time audio to accompany the video. With 120 frames per second in shooting bank A, I rarely will have a microphone on the camera walking around. Just not practical for a lot of situations. But when I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, this will be feeder setup, warblers in the woods, owls in the woods, situations where you're going to be at a fixed situation. You're not really moving. You've got tripod set up. This is about stability. This is about optimal quality. We're going to have a microphone on here. I'll probably have the Rode Wireless Pro connected for a gain to kind of get my 32-bit float audio. So everything is about quality in my shooting bank B. So my shooting bank A is speed. Shooting bank B is quality. Shooting bank C is my, I'll call it my landscape and my real estate bank. So this will be, I'll have it set up where I have an option to go to aperture priority, which I do like still shooting for fixed subjects. The frames per second, so it'll be 60 frames per second video with this. This gives me the opportunity to still slow down the video, but this one will be captured in ProRes at a higher quality, like the 30 frames per second bank, versus H.265 for the running gun. So with 60 frames per second, for real estate as example, I'm doing a push in into a room or walking down a hallway, that sort of footage. The 60 frames per second allows me to slow it down 2 to 2.5 times, depending on dropping into a 30 frames per second timeline or a 24 frame per second timeline. So it gives me some options for how I want to utilize that footage. Also, from a landscape standpoint, if I've got a waterfall kind of cascading, that sort of thing, 60 frames per second can again be dropped down as a slow motion at a higher quality. So that's where those settings come in. So that's my shooting bank C, and then shooting bank D is my studio. That's in here. Right now I'm actually shooting on the Z30. Ideally I'd have the Z8 on the tripod photographing me or filming me for the higher quality, but when you're making videos on the Z8, it makes it a little bit tougher, so you have to utilize other cameras. So that's kind of the quick overview of my bank. So now we'll kind of have a little bit more of a walkthrough and discuss what I've done and what decisions I have made with them. So the one thing, let's touch on that right now. How I access all of these is the info button, the I button. So what I've done, so the I button is, I find I don't utilize it a lot. Between the custom function buttons and how I'm utilizing these banks, I find I rarely have to go in and actually utilize the I button. So it's one of those ones that you've got, what have you got? A dozen different options for accessing different parts of the camera. What I've done, and the most important part is if you can see, I've got shooting bank A and custom A. So that's the shooting banks and the custom settings bank. So all I have to do, switch both of them to B, and I've completely converted the camera over now to the high quality mode from the run and gun mode. Same again, switch to C, and I've now changed all the custom functions now to my landscape mode. And so what I've done is you have to go into the I menu. So under controls, you've got customize I menu. Under video, you've got customize I menu. You have to do this for A, B, C, and D for all of them. And you have to, so what I've done is open up every one of those menus and make it so that the shooting menu bank and the custom settings bank are in the same spot on the I menu on every single one. So whatever bank I'm in, hit the I menu and I can quickly switch. And that's how I managed to really utilize these shooting banks effectively, is using the I menu. Some of the options you can set it up as a custom function button. The shooting bank you can get to from custom function buttons, but you can't get to the custom settings bank. So you really kind of want to use them both in order to kind of get the most out of it. So that's the way I've done that with the I menu. So let's have a look at my shooting bank A, and we'll kind of walk through the key features I picked in it and give you an idea of how I've set it up, and then also hopefully this will give you some insight into how best you want to set up your camera and how you can kind of, how you can take advantage of these banks properly. So high efficiency star, as we said, this is about speed. This is about as good as I can get from the camera. Like I say, a slight compromise in image quality with a definitely gain in speed. It's funny, as one I haven't shot, when I first got it, I was shooting lossless raw. I switched over to high efficiency, and that's kind of been shooting it almost all the time going out the door. The other day I was out and I switched it back to lossless compressed, and almost immediately noticed the buffer and speed change. So it was okay. That would kind of really confirm my decision to use high efficiency star. ISO sensitivity settings. So this is definitely going to be an auto ISO with this bank. I'm going to run up to 16,000 ISO. I find 12,800 is my preferred maximum ISO. I'm very happy up to 8,000, 9,000 ISO. Once you get beyond that, you definitely notice some image quality compromises. The reason I have 16,000 set as my maximum, just some situations where it might be almost dark and I want to be able to still get the shot. So that's what I've utilized there. So auto ISO makes sense for this setting for sure. White balance, auto 2. So this is basically a warm natural light. It's basically a natural light auto with a little bit of a warm take on it. So you'll notice here almost everything is shut off. And the reason being, when you're dealing with wildlife, and this is outside, most of these things will not take effect, so there's no point in having them on. I will implement them, especially on the real estate side of things and the studio side of things. They do have some value there. So, but right now for the wildlife side of it, doesn't make sense. So to reiterate, shooting bank A and shooting bank B are my long lens. So this is what I'm going to use, a telephoto lens. These are the banks I'm going to use. So these are the settings that I've implemented that when I'm out in nature, so this will never be indoors. This will always be outside under natural light. To be no fixed light sources in this sort of setting. Metering, everything will be matrix metering. That's kind of my go-to. I've played with the highlight weighted metering in the past, and definitely has its feature. It works very well in an open environment, but I find you quickly struggles when you get into like a forest environment with dappled lighting. It'll pick up a bright spot and then it'll adjust the exposure accordingly, and that's less than ideal for me because I'm so often in a forest environment. So matrix is what I want, where you're reading the whole scene. You can then make the adjustments on exposure compensation as needed. So AFC mode, obviously everything's going to be shot with continuous focus mode. AF area mode, so now I'm utilizing the auto area AF. So this shooting bank, if you haven't watched it, I have an autofocus video where I went through after firmware 2.0 discussing my different autofocus choices. I highly recommend watching those. There's 2 videos in that one. And again, that's to relate to shooting bank A here. A lot of great info in there that I highly encourage you to watch. I'm not going to cover that right now. So this one will be auto area AF, will be typically the shooting bank I leave the house with for this setting. Subject detection options, obviously, is going to be birds for this one. Vibration reduction, sport, and again, everything off there. Okay, so that's kind of the nitty gritty for the photo shooting menu. It's pretty simplistic for this one. So let's take a look at the custom settings menu. And this is where you can really take control of these shooting banks and really kind of perfect them for your shooting style and your subjects. So AFC, as we were saying, focus tracking with lock on, set to 3. With this camera, 3 seems to work really, really well. I used to use 5 all the time on my D500, but I think the settings are quite different now with this camera. So 3 and steady, which is actually the default, and this applies to the auto area AF. 3D is only ever at 3. You can't adjust it beyond that. So a lot of these things will be set. If I'm not mentioning it, basically set at auto. AF on only. I'm still an AF on. Focus button on the back is still what I use. There's some arguments to be had now with the new settings that you don't need it with the 3D tracking and the like. It's still just kind of what I've used for so many years now. It still makes sense for me to kind of just stick with it. Limit AF. So the autofocus, I'm just going to do a quick scroll through. I highly recommend you check out my other videos on this to give you a bit more in-depth of how I've done that. It'll just get too long if I try and go into that right now on these settings. So 3D tracking, auto area AF, and single point. Basically, for focus mode restrictions, I want this a continuous AF. That's the only thing I want it to be. I never want it to switch, especially in photo mode. This is part of the new firmware 2.0, which I really like, is the focus point border width, which I have set to 2. Basically makes for a thicker border around it in red. Makes it nice and visible, so less likely to have the focus points tucked in a corner where you don't realize it, especially utilizing 3D tracking. So focus peaking is on. This is when you manually start focusing, you will see the red lines, the zebras, to show you what part is in focus. Works great. Highly recommend having that on there. Did a video on a release timing indicator the other day. Definitely check that one out if you're curious about that. Has some features that are worthwhile. The high frames per second viewfinder display function, I highly suggest turning this on. This will make sure there's no lag when you're looking at tracking a moving subject or the like. Works excellent. Definitely turn this one on. Not going to touch on flash at all. Okay, now let's have a look at the custom controls. So again, a lot of this was covered in my autofocus firmware 2.0 video. So just a quick overview here. Like I said, for all the autofocus for shooting bank A, have a look at the autofocus video, and that'll be a lot clearer and a lot more concise about what I've done. But function 1 is the recall shooting function hold, and this allows me to switch to single point. Cycle AF area mode, this switches between 3D and auto area AF, so this is kind of my run and gun fast. I can switch back and forth. The autofocus button is still going to be able to allow me to adjust all my different autofocus settings. Function 3 I've set as my silent mode, which is great. I actually utilize this in my shooting bank A and shooting bank B. Be able to push that and the camera goes silent, which is just awesome. I was photographing a male Anna's hummingbird the other day, and I really noticed that it was kind of picking up on the shutter sound, even though I had it quite quiet, because it's actually similar to their call. Hit the silent mode, didn't disturb it at all. It worked awesome. So really nice having that at your fingertips. AF on, so I leave that as the AF on button. So this one is FX to DX. This one applies more to the video side of it than it does the photo side. It was one of those things that I either leave it as reset as well as the OK button as reset, which is what I've normally used. I'm just trying this out to have FX or DX as an option. I generally don't switch to DX when I'm taking photos, but it might make some sense for file size down the road. So that's why I've decided to give that a try. Display button, I just leave that as display button. Reset is the OK button. So this is another one that I'm just actually utilizing now. So in photo mode, the record button now is the release mode, which is actually really handy. So in my shooting bank A and B and C, actually, having the release mode on the video button is super handy. It'll allow me to switch to timer for when I'm shooting landscape stuff in shooting bank C. But for A and B, it allows me to do a quick switch to get to the 30 frames per second with the pre-capture in JPEG. Don't use it a lot. I hardly ever used it when it was on the button on the left side here. But switching it where it's on the trigger side, it makes it a lot easier to switch between it. So I think there's some value to having it there so that you can actually switch back and forth. Hopefully in the next firmware update, I imagine it's going to be in the Z9 first, where it goes to raw pre-capture. I really hope that it ends up in the Z8 with raw pre-capture. It'd just be a really nice feature to have. Then I'd really utilize it a lot more. But for now, I don't really switch to JPEG that often. And then exposure compensation I leave as is. ISO I leave as is. I really don't want to change those ones. With this camera, it's so accessible with the buttons and switches on the outside. Where possible, I leave them as their native function. It just makes sense for me. That's the way I've always shot with DSLR days. So I really don't want to be changing buttons up where I don't need to. So ISO and exposure compensation just make sense where they are. And everything else then is at default. Okay. Shooting bank. So now we're on to the video recording menu. So this one this one's quite important. So I picked H.265 10-bit. And the reason I've gone with shooting at N-Log, so you have some nice color adjustments once you sit down at the computer with DaVinci Resolve. So the reason I've gone this route is that you get 120 frames per second as an option. It's only available in H.265 or in NRAW. But the reason I've picked it in the H.265 10-bit is file size for sure. The NRAW files at 120 frames per second get huge really, really quickly. But also this one has the feature when you can switch from FX to DX, and the DX crop at 120 frames per second is a 2.3 times crop. So it's a phenomenal magnification. So for birds, you can't get closer. You know, you're trying to photograph or take video of an eagle's nest, push the button, you're at 2.3 times the magnification. Just fantastic. So frame rate, 4K 120. And most everything else off. And then so metering, we're going to be dealing with matrix metering again. Focus mode in this one is AFF, so this is full-time autofocus. So basically, if the camera's on, it's trying to find a subject and focus, if it's in video mode. Then the AF area mode, again, auto area AF with subject detection birds. This one is great. So this setting will be typically, I will be at the beach, wetland area. That's where I'm going to be utilizing this setup the most. And so having the auto area AF just makes sense. And again, the videos prior would really help to explain this a little bit better. Vibration reduction on. I shoot with an FTZ adapter, so the vibration reduction is actually set by the switch on the lens, not in camera. But if you have a non-VR lens, then the IBIS will be set from in camera with this. So you kind of have a combination of how it's set. Microphone sensitivity. Again, this will just be kind of ambient recording for audio with this one. And it just gives me some audio feedback if I need to sync it up in post later. But typically audio with 120 frames per second, because you're going to be slowing it down, you'd ideally want to have a second recording source. So that if you want to have kind of real-time audio, you need to record it separately from then in camera. So now let's have a look at, so when you go down to video now, you've got the custom controls in the video mode. So function 1 is live view info. So that gives me, click that, that'll give me a nice clear screen with no nothing showing on it. Handy. And this would be basically because in video mode, you don't need as many of the function buttons. So especially in 120 frames per second. So that's why I've picked that one. That one's more of a still in trial mode, we'll say. I haven't quite figured out if it'll stay at that selection or not. Cycle AF area mode. This one's very important in video. So this allows me to switch between my AF focus modes. Single point's really important here. With single point on your subject. With AFF, it's focusing on that exact point. So really handy, makes sense. And that one does not use subject tracking. So that's just whatever you focus on, it focuses. So that's a great one. If you just want to focus on something other than wildlife, you can switch to that. Subject tracking. So this one's similar to 3D, but you do have to engage it. Basically, you put the focus point over top of the subject. If you hit AF on, it starts then tracking that subject. And it basically will focus in video mode. It will follow, the point will follow the subject around the frame. Similar to auto area AF, but you engage it. So you're kind of picking which subject you want it to stick with. It's very handy to have on there, especially if your auto area AF is kind of picking up branches or the like. This will hopefully prevent that, but still give you tracking. So function 3 is virtual horizon. In video mode, I find it is nice being able to have the virtual horizon. Again, some of these function buttons, I'm finding that I haven't quite found the perfect home for each one yet, function-wise. So some of them, it's more of still in a bit of a trial period. The more I shoot it with it, I might switch some of these ones up. AF on button, and so AF on in video will actually switches it to AFS. It actually changes it so that it'll actually lock focus at the point where you're at as in AFS mode, as opposed to AFC or AFF. So it is handy if you are in a position where you're finding the focus is jumping a little bit with the AF area mode, and it's kind of not quite sticking where you want it, you just hold the AF on button down and it'll actually lock the focus on the eye, for example, or wherever you need it. So in the 120 frames H.265 10-bit, one of the really nice features is the joystick button. When you press it, it's the switch FX to DX, and this actually goes to a 2.3 times crop. Super useful. This is basically a huge magnification, really useful. Highly encourage you to give that one a try. So that's a big reason I picked the H.265 10-bit versus ProRes or something else, is being able to do that zoom in, and it's great. I utilize it a lot when you've got a subject that's too far to photograph, but it's, you've got an eagle and a post and it looks awesome, but it's just too far and you can't get any distance, you can't get any closer to it. Hitting that, switching to slow motion video, 2.3 times crop, you might get that takeoff, and all of a sudden you've more than doubled your magnification of your lens. It's just an excellent feature, really handy to have. So I definitely like that. One's a big one for me. Display button, reset button, so that basically centers put your focus point back in the middle. So other than that, pretty much everything here is as default. Okay. I hope you got some good info from this video. Stay tuned for part 2 on shooting Bank B. Please like and subscribe. Till next time, see you out there.